Are police officers allowing their personal biases to negatively affect the way they deal with the general public and possible criminals? Yes, obviously. Have you not been paying attention? But what's newsworthy is the fact that they're allowing these personal biases to even negatively affect the way canine units operate. Police often use dogs at places like border crossings to sniff for drugs in the hopes of catching potential smugglers. And dogs are really good at sniffing out drugs. In fact, they have about 50 times the total number of olfactory receptors that we have. And the parts of their brain that's used for processing all of that information is about 40 times larger than humans, proportionately speaking. So dogs are, in fact, really good at sniffing out drugs or missing people, or, according to some preliminary research, maybe even cancer cells. The problem is that humans need to train the dogs to do those things. And when the dogs are trained, they go out into the field and they work with another human who has to keep up that training. And that is where we start running into the Clever Hans effect. Clever Hans was a horse who got famous in the early 20th century for his supposed ability to solve mathematical problems. You could ask him or write on a chalkboard something like 2 + 1, and he would stamp his hoof 3 times. And the problems could actually be pretty complex. It could be something like, if the 8th day of the month is on a Wednesday, then what's the date of the following Tuesday? Something like that. And he was pretty much always right, which drew a lot of attention. With that attention, though, came the curiosity of some researchers who decided to take Clever Hans and see if he really could, in fact, figure out what these mathematical problems were. And what the researchers realized was that Clever Hans could only solve the problems if he was looking at the person asking the question, and if the person asking the question knew the answer to the problem. In other words, Clever Hans was very clever, but not so much at math. But he was clever at reading people and understanding when the questioner wanted him to stop stamping his hoof. Even Clever Hans's owner probably didn't know what was actually happening, at least at the beginning. And that's why it's so important to double blind our experiments. We need to make sure that both the person in the experiment, or the horse in the experiment in this case, and the person asking the questions, the person running the experiment, don't know what the desired result is, because it's really, really hard for us to control for our own biases. It's really difficult to not constantly give subtle cues about what we're actually thinking. Like the fact that I am currently thinking about a burrito, which you can tell by the way I'm gesticulating with my hands in the shape of a burrito. And also because I'm always thinking about burritos. You're probably already able to guess how Clever Hans relates to drug-sniffing dogs. The dogs are usually well-trained, but then they have to go out into the field with a human who they desperately want to please. A federal appeals court has just ruled that the use of a drug-sniffing dog was totally legal, even though the dog in question, Lex, was found to signal that he had found drugs 93% of the time that he was used. But when those people that he was signaling on were searched, drugs were only found about 59% of the time. So in other words, Lex was subjecting tons and tons of people to invasive searches, and in the end, he was barely better than a coin flip at determining who actually had drugs on them. It turns out that Lex's handler was giving him a reward every time he alerted, regardless of whether or not drugs were found. So Lex was learning that in order to please his human, he just had to say that he had found drugs, whether he actually smelled them or not. Despite his terrible success rate, he was actually doing better than dogs in a previous study in Chicago. Chicago drug dogs were found to only have a success rate of about 44%. In other words, less than a coin flip. Literally just flipping a coin would have better enabled the cops to determine whether or not someone had drugs on them. And if you narrowed it down to just Latinos, then the drug dogs were even worse, and their success rate was about 27%. So it's really clear that the dogs were relying mostly on their handlers' biases. Despite all of that, the dogs are still being used to sniff out drugs, and the federal courts are still giving the go-ahead for their continued usage in the future. And there are absolutely no controls in place to take care of the clever Hans effect. So really, moving forward, the only scientifically reasonable thing to do would be to either stop using drug dogs entirely or stop using human police officers. That would be my go-to, because an unbiased dog would have a much higher success rate at sniffing out drugs. So the total number of drug convictions would go up. The total number of people gunned down on the streets for not doing anything would probably decrease significantly. And tummy rubs would go up. I mean, everybody wins.